Welcome to the new Innovation Matters podcast series of the United Nations Economic Commission for Europe. Innovation Matters aims to engage leading experts on a range of topics to explore how innovation could drive sustainable development in Eurasia and beyond. Our episodes explore ongoing trends, opportunities, and challenges such as the fourth industrial revolution, the sharing economy, the circular economy, autonomous vehicles, and digitization. Welcome to Innovation Matters. Capitalism, or free and competitive markets, underpinned by our other guests, what our other guests talked about, Mokure on the culture of growth, has undoubtedly triggered and enabled the experimentation with ideas to create value that has led to the unprecedented and sustained growth that McCloskey calls the great enrichment over the past 2 centuries. It has taken billions out of abject poverty and enriched our lives in ways that, for Newton, for instance, and his contemporaries, would be undistinguishable from magic. Yet the word capitalism is controversial, and from a broader perspective, commercial society is still new and takes time for humans to understand and adapt to. We associate it with neoliberal extremism. We blame it for everything from poverty, inequality, and environmental destruction, all the way to war. Even on the liberal side of the debate, people like guest Mike Munger argue that cronyism, lobbying, and entrenched interests are almost inevitable. On important issues, we feel comfortable relying on government intervention rather than on innovation and private incentives. While few would reverse liberalization of, for instance, telecommunications and air travel, or advocate outright state ownership of the means of production or outright socialism, capitalism remains controversial and often misunderstood. To explore this issue, we have the honor of welcoming our guest, Reinhard Zitelmann, historian, sociologist, best-selling author, and entrepreneur. Dr. Zitelmann, welcome to Innovation Matters.
Thank you.
So, Dr. Zitelmann, what was the motivation for writing this book, and what's your target audience? I think this has been a concern with you for a long time. What drove you to put everything to paper? And I congratulate you, by the way, for the richness of the topics you cover in what I think is only 200 pages in the printed version.
Oh, thank you. I think today capitalism is under attack almost everywhere in the world. I traveled this year and last year to 30 countries because the book is published in 30 countries, and I promised to go to every country, and not only to talk about the book, but I spoke in every country with analysts, with people from think tanks, with economists, with ordinary people. And what I see is that let's start with Asia, maybe because this is very important. In Asia is a very positive example how capitalism can help. In China, in the end of the 50s, there was the biggest socialist experiment in history, Mao Zedong's so-called Great Leap Forward. 45 million people died. And this is now something that is very interesting. Wherever I am, in which country I speak, I ask my audience whether they have heard about this biggest socialist experiment in history, the so-called Great Leap Forward, where 45 million people died. And whether I speak in Asia or in Latin America, in the United States or Europe, or whether I speak to 20 people, to 200 or 2,000, almost no one had heard about it. They haven't heard about this at school. I have always the same question. Have you heard about this so-called Great Leap Forward at school? And almost no one raised his hand. So what happened in China? This is a very important topic for me. After this Great Leap Forward, there was the Cultural Revolution. And then even in 1981, after Mao's death, 88% of the people in China lived in extreme poverty. 88%. Today it's less than 1%. How did it happen? Because Deng Xiaoping started with his uh, economic reforms, introduced private property, and launched some free market reforms. And the result is that so many people came out of poverty. And if you look to other Asian countries, South Korea is another example. South Korea was one of the poorest countries in the world in the 60s, North and South Korea. Then in South Korea, they had this capitalist system, and now it's amazing when you go there, the progress that they made in the last decades.
Um, Dr. Sietelman, these are all very fascinating issues, and your book in defense of capitalism, which I highly recommend, is in good company. Some of which you cite, and some of which we have as previous or planned guests on this program, such as Deirdre McCloskey, Johan Norberg, Russ Roberts, McAfee and Brynjolfsson, Mingyardi, and of course Pinker. One of the things I liked about your book um, is that most of these other authors rely quite a bit on Victorian Britain and on US examples. We know less about, for instance, when Germany industrialized and grew, which was in a completely different way than Britain did. You have many examples of Germany. I think one turning point in Germany that maybe will interest people, which is also relatively recent, rather than talking about Bismarck in the 20s, is Ludwig Erhard reform. Now, the standard narrative on this, and I think part of it is myth, is that we had the occupying forces, they were controlling everything, and then on a Sunday, I think Ludwig Erhard all of a sudden created the Deutschmark. And it wasn't as much an explicit choice for liberalism as it was almost anything is better than the situation that we're in. And there was enormous support and almost fetishization of the Deutschmark. Tell us about what happened there and what we can learn from it.
First of all,
or any other interesting points from German history that
yes,
you would
yes.
like to bring up.
First of all, I wrote my first doctoral dissertation about Adolf Hitler and about his economic ideas, about his
We'll
economic
put a
thought.
link up. We'll put a link up to this and other publications mentioned.
It's the name of the book is Hitler's National Socialism, and one of the results was that Hitler was much more anti-capitalist and socialist than most people think. Of course, he was not a socialist in the old-fashioned way who want to nationalize all means of production. He had another idea. Entrepreneurs should own their so-called private property, but in fact, the state should tell them what they do with their private property. And this is, of course, it has nothing to do with capitalism or with private property, his idea. And he became more and more an admirer of the Soviet Union, of the planned economy in the Soviet Union. He thought that the planned economy in the Soviet Union was much superior to American capitalism. By the way, he was also admirer of Joseph Stalin. So this was the system that in National Socialism that went more and more in the direction of planned economy. And after the Second World War, of course, the story was another story influenced by the Marxist fascism theory. According to this theory, fascism, they don't like to use the word National Socialism because the word socialism is included in. So they speak about fascism. And for them, fascism was a kind of dictatorship of the financial capital or something. And they blamed capitalism for fascism. They blamed capitalism for the war. And so we had in a lot of countries, for example, in the UK and also in Germany, a very strong anti-capitalist resentment. A lot of people were against capitalism. And when Ludwig Erhard came, he believed in a market economy, but I think he had a good marketing idea. He gave it a new name. He called it what you say in German, soziale Marktwirtschaft. So he would never speak about capitalism. He spoke about soziale Marktwirtschaft. So what sounded much better than only Marktwirtschaft, market economy, or not to talk about capitalism, the word. And so he could sell it to a part of the people in Germany, this idea. There was not a real majority. The elections, we had the Social Democratic Party there. They were for planned economy and socialism at this time, and it was a very narrow result between these parties. But in the end, Konrad Adenauer won the election, and Ludwig Erhard was the minister for economy in Germany, and he started then with this what he called this soziale Marktwirtschaft. The problem is that today there's a misinterpretation of his idea. Today, people stole this word, soziale Marktwirtschaft, and what they mean with this is something totally different. It's the best way. It's the third way between capitalism and socialism. But this was never something where Ludwig Erhard was for. He was a great admirer of the free market system. It was only his marketing idea to call it a little bit in a different way. But then after the 60s, in the 70s, we had more and more in the state intervention, and even in the 80s and the 90s, Germany had more and more state intervention. The state had a much bigger role. Poland, for example, is a perfect example. Poland was one of the poorest countries in Europe in socialist times in the 80s. And then they started the free market reforms with Balcerowicz in 1990. And now, since 3 decades, Poland is Europe's growth champion, with the GDPs per capita is now 3 times higher, almost 3 times higher than it was when they started with their pro-capitalist reforms. And you have so many examples in history. Maybe this is a different approach, a little bit a different approach between me and some of the other guests that you mentioned. I like very much Steven Pinker, and I had a conversation with him, and I learned a lot from his books. But there's one problem, or maybe one thing where he and I have a different approach. He says that 200 years ago, things started to become better and better and better. And he compares the situation 200 years ago and now. And in his book, he has a lot of chapters where he shows that we have less wars, that standard of living increased, poverty was reduced, similar things that I'm talking about. But the reason is, the question is, why did all these things happen? Why did all these things happen? And my answer is, because 200 years ago, they started with capitalism. 200 years ago, 90% of the worldwide population lived in extreme poverty. Today, it's less than 9%. This is the whole story. It's all about capitalism. This is the reason. This is a little bit the difference between me and Steven Pinker. I think he would agree with me to several degrees that capitalism played a role. But for me, this is the answer. And if you don't believe in it, some people give you the answer, no, it was industrialization. But how did industrialization happen? Because of capitalism. And you don't have to look 200 years back. It happens time and again. I spoke about China. Why did the situation improve so much in the last decades? What happened in the beginning of the 80s? Introducing private property, capitalism, free market reforms. Why did the situation change in Poland? Why did the situation change in Vietnam? It's always the same reason, because of capitalism. So you don't have to go 200 years back. But if you go 200 years back, this is the real reason for it. So this is my answer. And maybe the difference between me and some other libertarian thinkers is that they think in a more abstract way about theory and the perfect system and so on. I have to admit that I'm bad with theory. I have no theory. The only theory that I have is more like a metaphor. It's not a theory. It's my test tube theory. Is that I say we have only this mixed economies everywhere in the world, and the great thing is with capitalism that you don't need pure capitalism. You don't need 100% capitalism. Even some drops of capitalism can change a lot. This is the great thing with capitalism. Keep this in mind. Even some drops of capitalism can help a lot to improve situation for people in their daily life.
I think one of the points that you made in the beginning is particularly important here. We had Mike Munger as a guest who likes to say that socialism is no unicorn, capitalism or perfect capitalism is also not a unicorn. What you have in the US is an institution called Ugly Pigs Contest, where you try to pick the prettiest of the ugly pigs. They're all ugly pigs, but capitalism is a less ugly pig than the alternatives. I think that that's a good way of looking at it. It's hard to argue that Victorian England was very protectionist, and who didn't have a company law, who didn't have a financial system to support everything, still saw the Industrial Revolution and the enormous growth after 1820. And the political system sort of dragged behind. But once you start this dynamism, once you create a spark, then it's likely to continue, especially if it focuses on innovation and intensive rather than extensive growth. Socialism might not be bad at extensive growth, just accumulating capital. Capitalism is much better at using that capital in a more productive way. And I wanted to speak about monopolies. What struck me the most was capitalism leads to monopolies. And here you actually, and to my delight, I discovered that you agree with Karl Marx and disagree with Ludwig Erhard. So it seems like a no-brainer that we should avoid monopoly. Monopolies can abuse their power. They can keep competition out. We see this line of thinking with Google today. We also see that companies also tend to lobby for regulations that look good, but which actually increase the cost of compliance and provide an additional shield on data regulation. For instance, complying with the detailed regulation is something Google is good at, and that a competitor would have to build from scratch, which is an additional barrier. So why you argue that monopoly is not a problem, or not, at least not by far a problem as much as people seem to think to be, and you argue that the benefits outweigh the goods. Can you explain to us a little bit what you mean? Because those, when you first read it, those are striking findings.
So I have several arguments. Anti-capitalists, one of their main arguments is that capitalism can lead to monopolies, and I agree. Yes, capitalism can lead to monopolies. First thing is, monopoly is not always bad. This is not something that is from me, but Schumpeter, he wrote a lot about this topic, and it's, I think, I will not go in detail now. It's a little bit complicated, but this is not my main argument. But it's also that monopolies are not always bad. But my main argument is another one, that the power of monopolies is always overestimated when they are on the height or the top of the power. I give you an example. Today, almost everyone thinks Google or maybe Facebook or Apple or whoever, that they are so powerful, and I think a lot of people would think that these monopolies will last forever. This is always what they think, that these monopolies are so strong that they will last forever. In my book, I have some examples that it's not true. There was a headline in the UK newspaper Guardian in 2007: will MySpace ever lose its monopoly? Was the headline. Will MySpace ever lose its monopoly? If I have a lecture today with young people, they even don't know what MySpace is, and even some people who know what MySpace is, they don't use it, because later there was Facebook and other social networks. And in the same year, 2007, there was the cover of Forbes magazine about Nokia. Nokia, who will ever catch the cell phone king? It was about the Nokia monopoly. Who uses a Nokia smartphone today? Or I give another example in my book. In the United States, some people use today the word Xeroxing if they make a photocopy. Why is that? I learned it even, I think I was in some other countries, even in some other countries, they use the word Xeroxing today. Why is that? Because Xerox had a market share in the 70s of 95% for photocopies. Today it's less than 2%. It's less than 2%. Why? Because of capitalist competition and innovation, or Kodak. Maybe you remember Kodak cameras. That was also monopoly. They had, I think, 85% market share of the US film market and similar market share of the camera market in the United States. And then they underestimated the shift to digital cameras, and then in the end they went in insolvency. They got broke. So there are a lot of other examples. So what I want to say, yes, capitalism can lead to monopolies. This is true. But capitalism destroys monopolies time and again. In 1914, Lenin wrote his famous book about imperialism at the last stage of capitalism. And what he said in this book was that the monopoly capitalism is the last stage of capitalism. But all of the monopolies that he mentioned as examples in his books were destroyed some decades later, or even some years later, because of capitalist competition. So this is what anti-capitalists tell us since 100 years, that there are these monopolies, and this is the last stage, and then the government has to do something against monopolies. This is one of the few points where I disagree. You mentioned this with Ludwig Erhard. Some people think the state should do something against monopolies. No, I don't think so. If you look in the history, most of the monopolies were not destroyed by the state, but almost all monopolies were destroyed not by antitrust legislation and these things, but they were destroyed by innovation and by competition. Because if a company becomes bigger and bigger and bigger, sometimes then they start to act, the people in the company, like state companies, like government officials. They become very slow in a way. You see, for example, IBM was such a company, such a monopoly, IBM. And so then there were smarter young people like Bill Gates at this time, who became a competitor, who had new innovations. Then there was Steve Jobs, another one, or even in Germany, the only new technology company that we have here is SAP. And these were former employees from IBM who had new ideas, but inside their IBM company, they were not able to realize their new ideas. And so they founded a new company, SAP, and became successful. The only monopoly that is really hard to destroy, the state monopoly. You can compare East and West Germany. By the way, I recommend, I made a film about this. I produced a film. You can find it for free on the internet. It's Life Behind the Berlin Wall. Life Behind the Berlin Wall. I did it with a free to choose network. It's only like 17 minutes to compare East and West Germany. And it's a good idea because the same country, the same people, the same history, the same culture, the same language, only a different economic system. So good for an experiment. And in 1989, for example, 27% of the tenants in East Germany had not their own toilet. They had to share their bathroom, their toilet with other people. In Germany, in West Germany, it was less than 1%, or almost everyone had their own toilet. And I like to compare things like this. I ask it always when I have my lectures. I ask people, what do you guess? How long did you have to wait for a car in East Germany? Oh, half year, 2 years?
Or like
No,
20.
no, no. It was between 12 and a half and 17 years. This is the correct number. Between 12 and a half. They don't believe it. I showed this film in Las Vegas. Anthem Freedom Fest is the biggest libertarian film festival in the world, and I'm proud I got an award for best short movie. And when I showed this movie, and there was this, people laughed. They haven't heard about it, and this is the real problem, that people haven't heard about socialism at school. History can teach us a lot, but the real problem is that students today in university, they learn a lot about the evils of capitalism, but they learn almost nothing about the evils of socialism. This is a problem today.
Yeah, and I think even the ones who learn about it tend to see it all around. Macaulay, for instance, an historian, said at one point, and I found a quote: "In every age, everybody knows that it's up to its own time progressive improvements has been taking place. No one seems to reckon on any improvement in the next generation." And he forecasted 300% growth 100 years later. He was way off. It was more like 1,000% growth, but everyone lambasted him at the time. But to go back a little bit to antitrust, you're right that antitrust legislation or antitrust action, it's very hard to see a track record of positive change there. You mentioned the IBM case, which was resolved at a time when everything else was different. Um, Standard Oil, for instance, there's absolutely no harm, and this is the other case against monopoly, no harm to consumers. The prices were very low. Kerosene was much better than everything else. It was available and affordable to all people because, of course, they were working on expanding the market rather than squeezing a smaller customer base, which makes perfect business sense. And even Google, that we're thinking about right now, and it's true that because of network externalities and the value of data, things might be a little bit different this time around, perhaps not as much, but even Google is spending its excess funds heavily on all kinds of wild and crazy ideas to see what works, presumably
Yes,
anticipating that the near monopoly they have right now is going to run out of diminishing returns. It will be replaced by something else. We don't know what, but history tells us it will.
exactly. I agree 100%. They anticipate what can happen. Sometimes they can anticipate, but if you would ask me if I think that Facebook is another example. They bought this new companies like Instagram, for example. If they had innovation in their company, but they bought other countries. But if you would ask me whether I think in 10 years whether Facebook has the same market position than they have today, I would be very surprised. And even Emerson, Jeff Bezos, he said it. He knows that no company will last forever. But this is my argument on if they are on the top of the power, they seem so powerful that people can't imagine that there's something different. Maybe they know it in an abstract way, but it's the same. Maybe if you lie there in the summer in June in the sun, and it's hard for you to imagine that in a couple of months there will be wind and there will be maybe ice on your car and so to get rid of. You know the abstract, but you can't feel it in this moment because, and this is so I think history is a good teacher. I think history is the best teacher for us, and so see, this is my special approach. um, I know a lot of these theorists, economists, and so on, and I appreciate very much what they are doing. but I'm not one of them. I'm a historian and a sociologist, and I I think we need some theory, but what I don't understand, for example, Ludwig von Mises, he wrote this great book. It's now exactly 100 years a book that he wrote, this great book where he proved that socialism cannot work. And this was such a great book because when he wrote the book, it was only 5 years after the revolution in Russia, and he understood it as a theorist, and I admire him for this. But today, you don't have to talk about theory. It's 100 years later. You can see it in history what happened. Look in history what happened, and the problem is, I I give you, maybe it's a crazy example, but I will give you one example. Imagine a housewife bakes a cake and invites guests on Saturday, and they get sick, even they have to vomit, and she understands something was wrong with the recipe. And then she takes some uh, other ingredients to the recipe. She sees something was wrong. She bakes the same cake with the same recipe, but some new modification. And the guests get sick again. They have to vomit. And then she understood, okay, the first two times it was not good. Something was wrong. But she takes again the same recipe, bakes the cake with some slight modification. And people again, their guests have to vomit. Of course, she has to invite every time different guests because the same guests will not come several times. Sure. So and and then she does the same thing 24 times with the same recipe, and guests always get sick and vomit. You will, maybe your answers, this is a crazy example. There is no housewife in the world that would be so crazy to do this. This is true, but this is exactly what socialists did. It's exactly what socialists did, to try always the same recipe with some slight modification. And this is what Albert Einstein said, to do the same thing in the same or similar way and expect a different outcome. It's another word for being insane.
Yes, yeah, definitely. Insanity is doing the same thing and expecting different outcomes.
Yes.
I don't know who said that. Um, but what strikes me in particular is that, um, and you referred to Mises several times. He's seen as a radical, and in some ways he was. Uh, but the argument that he made in that book is absolutely clear and convincing. And there was after that this calculation debate, which I think was also clear and convincing without even looking at the evidence of practice. But we still hold on to it for some reason, and I hope that we can discuss that a bit more in the second episode. The other thing I wanted to mention is the other objection to monopoly is consumer harm. Um, First of all, I can't really think of one single antitrust action that actually addressed clear consumer harm, and it's very hard to argue that U.S. is creating harm. That Google is creating harm today, or at least more harm than good. Um, and uh, and uh, and 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 the second thing is that we're now expanding the scope of antitrust regulation. I think there was, I don't know in which country it was, uh, by removing the necessity of consumer harm and broadening the concept, which can of course be very dangerous and be a disincentive to innovation. But I'm using that as a bridge to the second point that you're making, that monopolies are useful, or perhaps at least more useful than they are harmful. Um, we know about IPR and the intent of IPR. We had an episode showing that this intent is on average not playing out anymore, and we need to reform. But still, I think everyone supports the idea. But you go further than that. You expand that argument. You talk about your own company and how it created a new market. So tell us a little bit about that, and then we should close this discussion because we don't have time to look into other issues. But let's explore that a little bit.
What do you mean exactly with my example? What I did?
I think what you meant by your example, you started a PR company
Yes,
for real
because
estate, and then
we spoke about this huge monopolies, but there are sometimes even very small, very small monopolies. And I had a company, a public relation company. I founded it in 2000s, and we were market leaders, not only market leaders in Germany. What we did was public relation and marketing for real estate companies, and a lot of very huge real estate companies were our clients. And we had something like a monopoly. There when I started with the company, there were only a few. You couldn't compare it. I think even our monopoly was much bigger in the aspect of market size if you compare it with Apple or with Facebook or something like this, because it was really something like a monopoly, where only when we started, or the first 10 years, only very few competitors. But this was good, because what I could do then, it was through specialization, that we were focused only on the real estate industry. At the time when I founded my company, there were, I think, that 1,500 other public relation companies, but most of them did a lot of things. They were not focused on something. And so the problem was that they didn't really understand. It's with this real estate business, it's in a way a complicated business. You have to understand it. There are a lot of tax issues, legal issues, and so on. And I could do a lot of training for my employees. And even we started with a division of labor, that we had some people in our company who were, for example, specialists for office buildings, or other for residential. And we had some people who only wrote texts, and other who made contacts with journalists. So we had a much deeper knowledge, what would be absolutely not possible if we would have had only like 3 or 4 clients. We had 50 clients, and it lasted even when I left the company. I sold it now 7 years ago, and of course there were then competitors with lower prices, or with we had very hard, we didn't take any client who didn't sign a contract for at least 1 year, and we had high prices at this time. And then there were competitors, of course, but I sold it, and and even now today it's number 1. There are some competitors, but they grew, and it's number 1. So and I'm happy about it. Now in February it will be 8 years since I left the company, and then I sold it, and it developed very well. They have more clients now, and so we could do a much better job for our clients than companies did before, but only because we had a monopoly. Because if you have only, maybe, for example, a PR company who has only 3 or 4 real estate clients, you can't learn so much and go so much deep in the topics to understand it. But if you have 50 clients or 100 clients who do similar things, then you can go much deeper in it and understand much better. So we did a much better job than our competitors. But this was only true because we had this monopoly for a time, because the prices were sometimes 2 or 3 or 4 times higher than what other took. So what I will say with my own example, that even, if you, nothing to compare it in any way with a Google or Amazon or so, but what I want to say, even a very small company in a niche that has a monopoly can create value and can give customer service that is only possible with a monopoly. And then we created a new niche, because then after 10 years, other companies started to focus only on the real estate industry. So we were role models for them because they saw, oh, he earns a lot of money, he makes a lot of money. Let's try something similar.
Yeah, I think there are two important points here, if you don't mind, that we try to crystallize them a bit. The first is that it's the prospect of perhaps monopoly or perhaps a premium on services that you do that you do in a new way. That is one of the most important incentives to innovate in the first place, because you face risks and you also need a prospect of high return. That's the first point. The second point is, if I interpret your analysis correctly, um, is that, or what we call demonstration effects. And this is where I think it's particularly important to innovation policy. It should play a catalytic role and help people try out more ideas. Because as you say, once you demonstrated that a business model was viable, other people came
Sure.
into the market. And there are many much more striking examples of this that we work with. It was the first person who set up an ICT service export company in Belarus, of all places, that sparked a sector that is now more than 10% of exports. It was the first person who set up a business process outsourcing company in the Philippines after they liberalized telecommunications. That sparked a sector that's now 20% of production and about 20% of employment. It was not in any plan somewhere. No one could even have imagined it. But these demonstration effects, I think, are essential. You also
And,
automotive
and,
sector in Moldova and so on and so forth.
and you see in the end, only to come to a conclusion, to add something to my example. In the 15 years when I run the company, we had average profit as a percentage of our turnover from 48%, what is a lot. For example, if we earned 5 million,
Return on capital.
no, not return on capital. From when we got from our clients, for example, 5 million, 2.5 was my profit in the end.
Hmm.
2.5 was my profit.
That's a
So
huge margin.
it's, yes, it's like 50%. And of course, today it's not like 50% because then other competitors came with much lower prices, and the man, it was an management buyout. So my former employee, I sold him the company, and of course he had to reduce prices because competition started. And this is a example how it happens all time and again. First, you have a monopoly and you have huge profits, but then, of course, other competitors, they see it, that they make a huge profit and they start. And what do they have to do? Better service or lower price. At this time, we had competitors who couldn't give better service, but they could give a much lower price at this time. And the result was that that our companies, or after I sold it, had also to reduce their fees uh, every month. And so in the end, it was good for the market, good for we had new competitors, and good for the clients now, because now they got the same service in a cheaper way. Why? Because of competition. And this is what always this is the positive function.
Yeah, and I think again the most important point here is that if you didn't have the prospect of making excess returns, you would probably not have taken the risk in the first place, or at least on average. I don't know about you personally, but the social utility of monopolies or potential temporary monopolies comes from the need for excess returns to invest in something that's risky.
The great thing is with capitalism is that capitalism works in a different way. People become rich because they have innovation and they create new products, new companies with great service, create new products, and they became rich. And who makes the decision whether they become rich or not? Are the consumers. When you use Google, you make Larry Page and Sergey Brin more rich. And when you use Amazon, you make Jeff Bezos more rich. So it's not the decision of politicians, not the decision of the state. It's the decision of ordinary people that they make every day. And this zero sum belief, it's it's um, it's so harmful, because if you believe that these rich people became only rich because they took it away from the poor, then the conclusion is we have again take something away from them and give it to the poor. That this would be the way to make poor people better off. But this is what never happened in history. So and this is the reason why I have this graphic always. Another example, if you see it all over the world, in the beginning of the 80s, 43% of the worldwide population lived in extreme poverty. Today it's less than 9%. This is what I mentioned. But at the same time, the number of billionaires increased from 500 in 2000 to almost 2,800 today. It's always the same development. Less people living in poverty, more billionaires. Vietnam, I mentioned it before, the poorest country in the world in the 90s, there was not a single billionaire. Today you have some billionaires, even you have a female self-made billionaire in Vietnam. And at the same time, when some people became very rich, other people escaped poverty. And this is the whole story.
Yeah, I would add a modification to that narrative, which actually strengthens the arguments that you are going to do. I think it's important to distinguish between people getting rich through incentives, through creating value, and of course, people in the former Soviet Union, where you see the oligarchs, or even in DRC, Congo DRC, which was very positive to capitalism for some reason.
But
Machinery,
we
but
have
not
our
much.
class in Germany. The Italians, they have their fashion, and the Americans, they have their Amazons and Apple and so on. Even in China, what is a much better economic system, or was a much better economic system than in Russia. They have also their Alibaba and Tencent, and I'm very thankful that we have to distinguish between the way how most people become wealthy in Europe or in the United States. And I think there are a lot of other things we can talk about. Feel free to suggest for another interview. We have a lot of about my survey about Poland, about Vietnam, so many topics. So now I think I we have a lot of topics, and let's have maybe another point for another topics.
So let's pass to the final question. I think many of the arguments, I think you're making a case that most people would accept anyway, but some like this are interesting. So, and this was a controversial book and a controversial argument in some place, yet it's very convincing and very clear. So I'm wondering, I like your discussion, for instance, about consumerism. You go through many of the crazy, comparing Gucci to the Gulag, comparing capitalism to fascism, and at the same time, people were growing. A lot of this was in West Germany in the middle of the Wirtschaftswunder, so people were seeing improvements all over. Yet many found these arguments so compelling, and I think this is at the core of your book. So tell us about the book was received and why you think that is.
For my new book now, yes, it's I'm very happy that I have so many translations. I mentioned it before that it is in 30 countries translated now, and I took the opportunity to discuss it with so many people, and I don't think that I can convince anti-capitalists with this book. This was also a question that one journalist in the United States asked me a couple of weeks ago. Do you think you can convince anti-capitalists with your book? And my answer was, no, I don't believe it. And he said, why do you write a book when you don't believe you can convince people? And my answer was, they will not buy the book. They will not read the book. I know it. When I post on Twitter or on Facebook, I have some comments from left wingers. This is all crazy. It's bullshit. It's all wrong. And then I asked only one question: have you read the book? No, I would never read a book like this. So this is the reason they prefer to buy book number 35, Why Capitalism is Evil. No, I wrote the book for people who are pro free market economy or pro capitalism, to support with all the arguments that you need to win every single discussion. And you don't have to read the whole book. For example, if you have a discussion about monopolies, read chapter, I think it's chapter 4 in the book. If you have a discussion, we didn't discuss it today, but very important topic, about environmental destruction or climate change, read chapter 3. If you have a discussion about inequality, read chapter 2, or about consumerism. So I gave it to support people with facts, with arguments. And the first review in Germany was in the first review about my book, there was one sentence, I liked it. Zittelmann is a fanatic of facts. And this is true. I'm a fanatic of facts. I don't like so much theories, but I'm a fanatic of facts. And you can find a lot of facts in this book from your discussion with anti-capitalists. This is the way I hope I can change things. And of course, it gave me an opportunity I had in a lot of countries, TV interviews, newspaper interviews with YouTubers. And so the book is only, like a vehicle for me to start a discussion about things. And I'm very sure that I couldn't have all these interviews when I would write a book why market economy is a good system. So I have this provoking. This is what we discussed about defense of capitalism, and this gives me the possibility to discuss with people. So, and I think so. The concept was okay. And now I have to go on with my work. I told you about the survey in 34 countries, but now I got the data from country number 35 from Egypt, and I have to do my work now to analyze the data from Egypt, how people in Egypt think about capitalism. This is my homework now.
Dr. Sietemann, unless everyone is convinced that it's good to be a fanatic about fiction, I think that was highest praise for your book, whether intended or not. So I congratulate you. It's been a very interesting discussion, and I look forward to the second episode where we'll talk a little bit more about attitudes to capitalism. Dr. Siedelman, thank you for being on Innovation Matters.
Absolutely. Thank you. Have a great day. Thank you
Thank
for having
you.
me.